and an MA from University of Nairobi. In the recent past, she defended successfully her PhD thesis, and in fact, today's topic is just an excerpt from that PhD thesis. So let us welcome Ms. Mary Wanyoike to tell us more about this topic. Wanyoike, welcome.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in this world. Today, I am privileged to be presenting an excerpt of my PhD thesis under the title of The Nexus Between Formal and Non-Formal Education in Kenya. Now, the two concepts, non-formal and formal education, are not really new to us. Formal education has existed since the invention of writing and the introduction of literacy. Non-formal education has also existed in various forms and identifiers in Europe, in Asia, and the Americas. In Africa, non-formal education also predated the colonial period. But we have two sets of non-formal education as per the kind of conceptualization that we have from the literature. So today what I'm going to discuss is just a nexus between the formal and non-formal education. And this discussion was inspired by some experience in the past. Way back in 1976, I crisscrossed the CBD. Every morning I'll cross the CBD, and every evening I'll cross the CBD. And I would find beggars on the streets. I would find street children. And by the 1970s, the 1980s, the number of the beggars and the street children had grown. And then within that same period, some mode of formal education started to make some appearance in the education sector. And the word non-formal education came to be in Kenya. Much of the non-formal education, however, that we'll talk about is in the post-independent period, post-colonial period. I will, of course, give a historical background so that I review literature in all the periods in an attempt to explain the existence of non-formal education and formal education and the conceptualization of the two as per a few of the writers, especially in the early period. Now, I will discuss it in three phases. The first phase is the pre-colonial period. The second phase is the colonial period, and the third phase is the Kenya independent period. So I'm giving it a historical perspective. So during the pre-colonial period, Africans had the indigenous education systems before the introduction of formal education. In pre-colonial Kenya, for instance, teaching and learning was integrated in other society, socioeconomic, and political activities. Learning took place all the time, in all places, during the day, in the evenings, at night, at home, in the fields, while weeding, harvesting, or even collecting firewood. In other words, there was no specific place or time that education did not take place. Education was lifelong, and the schedules were flexible. Teachers varied in age, gender, experience, and expertise, depending on the purpose, the age, the gender of the learners. Except in some specific skills training, education of children, youth, and adults was the responsibility of not just the nuclear family, but also the extended family. The community, therefore, at large, was involved in the education of the young. And when I talk about community, I am talking about even that young child who carried the baby and sang the lullabies. That was the person who introduced the child to the language. The sounds of the lullaby were the form of language that the child first knew in the pre-colonial period. And so this description that I'm giving is a description that talks about an education that was not always deliberately planned. It was an education that was not always consciously planned. The person would sing to the baby because the baby was crying, or because she wanted the baby to go to sleep. Another form of unplanned education was the informal education. I'm giving it the title now, informal education, where learning took place via socialization and social interaction. Often, in informal education, there was no conscious or deliberate planning of the education. It was a part and parcel of the socialization process. It was by imitation. It was by mimicry. It was by observation and listening. Not because the teacher or whoever you're learning from told you to sit down and I'll teach you. But whoever you are learning from was there going about the business, but at the same time inducting you to the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and the values of that particular society. The teachers were diverse, as I've already indicated. The delivery systems were also diverse, as I have already indicated. It is through these diverse methods, through these diverse teachers, that therefore a person learned about the norms, the traditions, the customs, the history of his or her community. Functional and acquisition of knowledge as well as the application of knowledge, skills, and values, was the hallmark of indigenous education systems. Significantly, age and gender played a role, not only in determining the nature of knowledge and skills accessed, but also in transiting from one level to the next. For instance, during initiation to adulthood rights, boys and girls were separately put in seclusion and inducted in gender-specific adult responsibilities. They were also inducted to society traditions, customs, and values. The transition to adulthood opened the gate to warrior grade for men and marriage for women. And therefore, in the next level, they also came across another category of teachers, in quotes, who would now tell them what the society expected of them. Now, in this kind of scenario, we see two scholars talking about indigenous education. I have chosen two because they have commented it in relation to formal education. And like our topic states, we are talking about the nexus between formal and non-formal education. So D.N. Sifuna and J.E. Otiende and S.N. Bogongo categorize indigenous education in Kenya as informal and formal. They don't talk about non-formal education when referring to indigenous education. Let alone in other writings, they of course talk about non-formal education. And when they talk about informal and formal education, they say that formal education was the education that was offered to those who, for instance, were undergoing the initiation rites. They both specifically give that example, that during seclusion, that is when these children turned adults were taught about the history of the community. That is when they were taught about the norms of an adult person. That is when they were inducted into behavioral life of an adult person, what is expected of them. And as such, then he says that because there was a period of seclusion, they say because there was a period of seclusion, then, and it was deliberately said that it came around this time, then this is an example of formal education. So the distinction in the pre-colonial period was informal and formal by the two writers. However, we also note that in that kind of description, the two, Sifuna also noted that there was a difference between formal education in the African context and formal education in the context of the Quranic schools. Bogongo talked about the Quranic schools, the duxes and the other forms of schools, and indicated that this was formal education. But they later say, no, there's a difference between that kind of education and the Western formal education. And the distinction was made by Sifuna and Otiende when they said that there was a difference in the approach, there was a difference in the curriculum, there was a difference in the Quranic, in the duration of the learning, the pedagogy of the education. So in the pre-colonial period, I'm saying that we have formal and informal education in literature, not non-formal education. Then during the colonial period, after the establishment of colonial rule, there was the establishment of Western formal education. This was initially done with the Christian missionaries because they wanted to train Africans to assist in the evangelization of the gospel. And so they introduced Western formal education and taught literacy, numeracy, and also religion to the Africans. Now, what we have during that period also, we find that the labels that we have so far come across indicate a relationship in all the three modes of education. And at this juncture, before I go on to the colonial period, before I go on to the post-colonial period, I want to now clarify what are these three modes of education that I am talking about. What is the definition of formal education? What is the definition of non-formal education? And what is the definition of informal education? Informal education, I've defined it as the intentional, conscious, or deliberate. The intentional, not informal. Informal education is education where the transmission of knowledge, skills, and values is done through social interaction and socialization. Much of the knowledge is through social interaction and socialization. So knowledge transmission is mainly incidental. It is incidental. In non-formal education, there is a deliberate, planned transmission of knowledge, skills, and values. It is deliberate, it is planned, sometimes it is institutional, and it includes various groups of the society. In literature, non-formal education is defined by Coombs, who talked about any organized educational activity outside the established formal system of education, operating separately or as an important feature of some broader activity that is intended to serve identified learning clientele and learning objectives. To Coombs' definition, Commonwealth Secretariat also defined non-formal education as organized learning activity outside the structure of formal education that is consciously aimed at meeting specific learning needs of particular subgroups of the community, be they children, youth, and adults. So in this definition, the Commonwealth Secretariat added that clarification that it is for youth, adults, and children. Secondly, non-formal education is contextual and met the diverse and multiple subgroups of the population. The multiple categories of learners, trainees, therefore require a diverse curriculum, learning venues, pedagogical approaches, assessment, timelines, and the timelines are determined by the individual learner and the aptitude of the learner. So how fast the learner acquires the skills, knowledge, and attitudes will be dependent on his ability to do the same. So that is non-formal education. But I must remind you that this non-formal education was, this definition of non-formal education was made in the 1970s by Cobbs, but precisely in 1974. And the reason for that was because it was mainly after independence that the term non-formal education was popularized. Before that, modes of education that were different from formal education were referred to by other terms. For instance, during the colonial period, other modes of education that did not meet the specifications of formal education, where formal education in this case refers to institutionalized, intentional, planned, rigidly structured form of education. An education that also, in this case, had a uniform curriculum, entry age specification, progression from one level to the other. These were the characteristics of formal education. So if I were to sum up the main distinctions between formal, non-formal, and informal, so that we move forward, I would be saying informal education, incidental education that is mainly passed from the teacher to the learner through social interaction, socialization via imitation, mimicry, and observation and reasoning. Non-formal, on the other hand, was deliberate. There was a deliberate effort to know what content are we passing, who is the learner, and the relationship of the learner. And there is also a deliberate effort to know that this education has a curriculum that we are going to use, and these are the methods that we are going to use. Non-formal education in pre-colonial societies was often done in skills training, and as I said earlier on, during the seclusion period, as per the two others that I have mentioned. So during the colonial period, there were also modes of education that were different from Western formal education. And the features of this other form of education, or the examples of these other forms of education, include night schools from 1900. The CMS, the Church Missionary Society, established night schools in the outskirts of Nairobi, that is Kabete. And they were establishing night schools because they realized that this formal education that we have established is not serving everybody. we need trained teachers. They cannot come aboard in the formal education because they are committed during the day. And therefore, we have to find another way of training the teachers, training the hospital attendants, and the other categories of personnel that they needed. They needed people who would learn literacy, yet they were committed also during the day. So night schools were established by the CMS missionaries to train the Africans in literacy, that is numeracy, reading and writing, so that they would also be able to read the Bible and in the process, help them in the evangelization process. So night schools were one example of non-formal education. The other example of non-formal education were the evening classes. The evening classes. And the evening classes were established in the Native Industrial Training Center. The Native Industrial Training Depot, not center. The Native Industrial Training Depot was established in 1924 as a formal institution. And its role was to train Africans in various skills: carpentry, masonry, blacksmithing, plumbing. All those skills were taught in the NITD. Then the process of the teaching, they realized that there is a lot of practical work going on during the day. The teachers are not available to teach theory classes during the day because practical work is taking much of the time. And therefore, there was a suggestion that evening classes should be introduced so that the theory classes should be taught during the evening. And that happened from 1926, when the theory classes were henceforth taught during the evening. The other example, evening classes, before I move from there, were also taught in what was called the Nairobi Evening and Continuation Classes. This was a program that was established by the Municipal Council in Nairobi to take care of Europeans and Asians who are not in any formal education setting. And so from 1937, Europeans and Asians were provided with an education outside the formal system of education from 1937. The evening, the Nairobi evening and the Nairobi evening classes were also taught to Africans from 1941. And so we have this as another mode of education taught outside the formal system of education. In that mode, Africans, apart from those ones who are in NITD, Africans learned skills like plumbing. They learned literacy. Adult classes were taught during the evening classes. They were also taught courses that would make them progress or later join the formal education, because some of the courses that were taught would also be examined formally and allow them to join the classes that was taught during the day. The guild examinations were some of the examinations that the Africans sat for, so that they would then proceed to the next level of education. Apart from the Nairobi evening and education, Nairobi evening classes, we also have non-formal education offered in Jean School. Jean School had the two, the formal and the non-formal. And here in Jean School, during the colonial period, Africans would be taught agricultural skills. They would be taught childcare. they would be taught other skills that they needed for administration purposes. So there were the chiefs, there were the administrators frequenting the gene skills for that purpose. That happened until the Second World War. During the Second World War, gene school and NITD were now turned into recruitment centers. And after recruitment after the Second World War, they were also turned to craft training centers where the Africans would be trained in the various skills that they needed for the purposes of integration into the society. Now, those are just some examples of the non-formal education in the colonial period that we find in Kenya. Notably, even as I present them as non-formal education, the word non-formal education was never used during the colonial period. They referred to them as evening classes. They referred to them as the Nairobi evening and continuation classes. They referred to them as informal education. I did not come across a situation where the word non-formal was used during the colonial period. It is in the post-colonial period, therefore, that we have the word non-formal education used. And during this post-colonial period, we find that other terms were also used to kind of make clear what this non-formal education that we are talking about was. And terms like alternative education, terms like alternative approaches to education, and complementary education were used in the post-colonial period. So it was clear that in the post-colonial period, there was the non-formal education in literature, because these terms are drawn from the literature of the post-colonial period, not beforehand. Beforehand, the terms were informal education or evening classes. Now, in the post-colonial period then, let's see what we have in terms of the conceptualization of non-formal education. What did they understand non-formal education to be? What did they describe it as? I have already given Cobb's definition of non-formal education: any educational activity that was carried out outside the formal system of education. It is a definition that was also expanded by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Tim Simpkins defined non-formal education by comparing it to formal education. And he contrasted the timings of non-formal education and formal education. When was formal education offered? When was non-formal education offered? He also contrasted the purpose of formal education and the purpose of non-formal education. And he argued that in formal education, there was the deliberate delivery of knowledge and skills that the society wanted delivered to the people. And he said, no, formal education, this was an approach that was also used by Fordham. Formal education was a long-term education. You begin in early childhood education, you go to primary education, you go to secondary education, you go to higher education, you are in formal education. In comparison, therefore, he said, when you look at non-formal education, you find that it consists mainly of short-term courses, of specific short-term courses. Two, using the same approach, he noted that in formal education, there is certification. At every level of education, there is certification. In non-formal education, there was no certification. To certify that one has learned a skill, one had to perform the task. So if you are learning carpentry, then you have to do some carpentry work to show that you have actually learned that skill. That was non-formal education, as per Tim Simpkins and Fordham. They also say that in formal education, it is a long cycle, like I have already stated. And in non-formal education, the cycle is short. You learn your skill, you go. In formal education, it is preparation for something else. You enter primary schools, you're preparing to go to secondary school, the linear approach in education provision. In non-formal education, it is recurrent. It is something that you can do today. You move from this skill to the next skill. You are not tied to a time frame. You are not tied to an entry age. You are not tied to the specifications of certification. It is part-time. Formal education, on the other hand, would be full-time. You go to primary school, the expectation is that you'll go through the primary school cycle to the end. Otherwise, if you are in non-formal education, you pick what you want to learn, finish, and that's it. You don't have to have the entire cycle done in one time. And that is why it was possible, therefore, even during the colonial period, to have education running concurrently with other activities. Like you'd be employed and you would also be doing some other activities. They also contrasted the content. In formal education, the content is standardized. Every person in Kenya would be doing the same history, the same arithmetic, the same geography. It is standardized. In non-formal education, there is no standardization. It is the person who knows what he or she wants to learn, and therefore gets the teacher to teach him that particular knowledge, that particular skill at a time when he is ready, when the person who is to teach is ready. So we are also talking of a contrast in academic versus practical education. We also note that they say that the clientele or the learners are the ones who determine the entrance qualifications and what they do when they enter. In formal education, on the other hand, there are some specifications of what you have to have before you can enter a school in formal education. The delivery in formal education, it is institution-based. In non-formal education, it is based on the local environment. You want to learn blacksmithing, you go to a blacksmith, because the blacksmith will also tell you, this is where I get the iron ore from. This is how we smelt the ore. And this is how we eventually fashion the knives and the other implements that we fashion, that we get from this ore. We also note that they say, in terms of delivery, non-formal education is flexible. Formal education is rigid. It has a rigid structure, often a linear and rigid structure. formal education is often teacher-centered. The teacher determines, okay, you want to know blacksmithing? Today we are going to know where we collect the ore from. Tomorrow we want to know how we get the firewood to smelt the ore. So it is the teacher. You have told the teacher what you want to learn. The teacher guides you in the best way he knows that this is the process that will lead you to what you want to learn. So there is flexibility. In formal education, on the other hand, there's no flexibility. The curriculum will be developed, the syllabus will be developed, the schools will get the syllabus, and they'll follow that syllabus without veering outside the syllabus. If you do so, then you'll be doing it out of the context of formal education. Non-formal education is learner-centered. Formal education is teacher-centered. So I have gone to that comparison by Tim Simpkins and Fordham to just have an attempt to have a clear picture of the two modes of education that we want to talk about in terms of their nexus. If the dichotomy is so wide, then how can they also have a nexus? What kind of relationship then would there be if these are the differences that we have in formal and non-formal education? Now we have other writers who try to indicate that there really was a relationship between informal, formal, and non-formal education. And one of them is N.J. Coletta and D.B. Holsinger, who not only distinguished formal and non-formal education, but also brought in informal education. And they posited that the key distinctive features in non-formal education was diversity, flexibility, in the usage of time, in the usage of space, and material. They added that the applicability of non-formal education was contextual and specific to different socio-cultural environments. Further, they defined informal education as incidental transmission of knowledge in attitudes and skills in the different cultural sectors. All they are emphasizing here is that when you talk about non-formal education, you have to put it in the context. In the context, the socio-cultural, the socio-economic context that you talk about. Another of this, the writers also say that the definition of non-formal education actually is about lifelong learning. He simply said, this is lifelong learning. And he deviated from most of the scholars by so doing, because others were saying other characteristics that he did not see. And therefore, that is also another way of looking at it. So we are saying that in view of Holzinger's definition, in view of Aaron Rodgers' definition, Aaron Rodgers chips in and says, this cannot be lifelong learning, maybe we call it open learning. Then we are saying that there is a seamless, the relationship between informal, non-formal, and formal is seamless, especially in independent Kenya. And Rodgers reviews non-formal education as a hybrid of formal and informal education. That you combine the two and you have non-formal education in terms of who are the learners, what is the pedagogy, and what is the outcome that is expected. Now, in Kenya, we have, in Nairobi, actually, we have Ekudayo J.D. Thompson, who demonstrated the intersectional relationship of the three modes of education. And he did not call them intersections, he did not call them hybrid, he called them interfaces. And when he talks about interfaces, it's like one is building into the other. That you have formal education. He actually used a drawing of, in a circle, of informal education building into non-formal education, which builds into formal education. Alan Rogers, on the other hand, decided to see it as a continuum without the intersection, and said, you have formal education, you have non-formal education, and you have informal education on the two edges. And then you start with non-formal, with informal education, then you move to formal education, and then you move to formal education. It is a continuum as far as he is concerned. The other one sees this as an intersection of the three modes of education. Now, if we look at, there's one more, and that is Gathenya, T.W. Gathenya, on the other hand, attributed the complexities of non-formal education to the comprehensibility. It's difficult to comprehend the various forms of education because of the manner in which they are similar, the near similarity. She talks about near similarity of the three, and therefore it becomes difficult to comprehend easily. So what we have then, if that is what the literature says, if that's what the literature says, then we say, what about in practice? Does that kind of conceptualization in literature, does it work in practice? And I'm saying that in practice, this interconnectedness was indeed evident in the night schools. It is a night, but it's a school. So school is formal education. Let's say the diction that is used indicates that intersection. Even in classes, which I mentioned earlier, shows that intersection. And holiday classes shows that intersection. Why should they be taught during the holidays? Holiday to who? Holiday to the ones who officially go to train formally. So there were holiday classes in NITD, and these were attended by both Europeans and Africans. Adult education classes is there. It shows immediately the link between what is taught and what is taught in formal education, what is taught in non-formal education. The only difference is that these ones are doing it at a separate time. And that is where the emphasis of diversity and flexibility comes in, that they're flexible enough for them to show that kind of relationship. We also have in the non-formal education in independent Kenya, various programs that indicated their informality. And one of them that we have here, we have the phases. I wanted to bring out clearly by simply calling them the phases of non-formal education in independent Kenya. We have the youth clubs, and the youth clubs were established after the state of emergency. There was the Starehe and Kariakoo youth clubs. The Starehe and Kariakoo youth clubs are what translated to the Starehe Boys Center. And Starehe Boys Center for quite a number of years operated as a non-formal institution. It was not until 1964 that it was registered as a formal institution. So there is that kind of shift from formal to non-formal education, illustrated by the history of Starehe Boys Center. We also have other centers, other training centers that are also transited from non-formal to formal. In fact, from informal to non-formal and to formal. And examples include the non-formal education training centers in St. John's Community Center. It was established by the CMS missionaries in 1957. During the independent Kenya, it not only took people who wanted to learn formally, but also had a program for street children in Nairobi. And from the street children in Nairobi, there was eventually the establishment of a non-formal school in St. John's Community Center. That also applied to the neighboring center by the same missionaries, the Christian Industrial Training Center, established in 1958, and became an industrial training center, a formal industrial training center, which was registered by the ministry in 1970s. Craft training centers like the YMCA, established in 1966, were also initially non-formal training centers. The National Youth Service, when it was initiated in 1964, it allowed entry to people who are not even learned. And therefore, from that point, then we were also considered as a non-formal training center. That also applies to the village polytechnics in 1966. And it also applies to the Undugu Society programs that were also established from 1960s, late 1960s. By 1979, the Undugu non-formal schools were established between 1979 and 1981. One in Korogosho, the other one in Pumwani, the other one in Kibera. Kibera was the latest to be established. There's another training center that was established in 1982, but crossed the boundary from non-formal to what was referred to as a community school. Now, let me say that all these centers that were established, the Undugu centers, the SJC centers, were mainly funded by the CMS or the NGOs. Those were the funders. They were not registered. And when they finally got registered, it was not by the Ministry of Education. It would be cooperative societies, it would be the Ministry of Gender, but not the Ministry of Education. So they remained outside the mainstream education system by not being registered, by not being funded, by not being supervised, by not being provided with teachers, unlike the others that were in formal education. So I was talking about Mukuru Promotion Center, which was established in 1982. And where it was initially labeled a non-formal education institution, Mukuru Promotion Center had characteristics of community schools as per the writings of Mujid and Nyamoita. And they said this is not an informal school, it is a community school. And the distinction that they made was that unlike the non-formal schools, this one is registered already, even though not by the Ministry of Education. The program here is also supervised by the Nairobi City Council. This one is run and managed by a PTA, the Parent Teachers Association. And the Parent Teachers Association consists of members who are elected by the community. So it is more of a community school, and a community school which is closer to formal education than to non-formal education, as per the distinctions that we have made. So in practice then, I would also look at the nexus in the practice what is this nexus that I'm talking about? I've given the definitions, I've given them I've given the names, the definitions, the rebels at each time period. So at what point then do we talk about the nexus between non-formal and formal education? That nexus comes in the management and supervision. For example, the example that I've given, that nexus comes in the curriculum of both formal and non-formal education. Undugu Society had a curriculum that had 4 phases, and in each phase, there was the equivalent of 2 classes of the 844 curriculum. So they used the 844 curriculum, and they also asked for assistance in the making of their curriculum from KICD. So KICD assisted. That was the case, for instance, in 2003, when they asked KICD to help them in reviewing the curriculum. In 2006, KICD also developed a non-formal basic education syllabus, and they were doing it for non-formal education, not for formal education. It had 3 levels, each level to be completed in 2 or more years. And in each level, the students were taught the 844 curriculum in a shorter period of time than it was taught in the formal education. So it was more or less accelerated learning. And then in addition to that, they added skills training to the teaching of that curriculum. But let me say that when this curriculum was taken to the non-formal schools, some schools did not did not teach it. Instead, they continued with their own programs. Instead, they decided then to do what? To have non-formal education, just as it is in formal education. They said, we are non-formal school, but we are teaching a formal education curriculum. But they wanted to remain non-formal because they said, we are flexible. There is there is free entry and exit. You can come, run for 3 months, and you find that you cannot continue, you exit, you come again, we will still take you on board. That was the case in Undugu Society. At least I got that information there. 2, you will come and you learn this education, but you will be at an age higher because you either never enrolled in education, or you enrolled and dropped out of education, or even after enrolling, or you are either a non-entrant or you never enrolled at any one time in formal education, and therefore you are out of school. And the non-formal schools would then say, we are taking care of those who are not being taken care of by formal education. Actually, I had that from one of the managers of a non-formal school. It said, we are not competing with formal education. We are only trying to aid these children who have either dropped out of school because they do not have fees, or are pushed out of school because of other reasons. Once we are done with them, they can still transit to formal education. So there's that bridge. And that is where the word complementary comes in, that we are complementing normal formal education. And by providing out of school children with non-formal education and non-formal training. Now, that was before 2003, where they would say, well, education is expensive, the cost is high because of the cost, the introduction of costs in the 1986 education policy, cost sharing. And therefore, because of that, there was eventually the 2003 FPE, Introduction of Formal Free Primary Education. And when that happened, actually, when free primary education was introduced, children moved from non-formal institutions or community schools or low-cost private schools to formal institutions, because here they are not paying. If the problem was cost, there's no cost in formal education. So they went to formal education for that particular purpose, to continue with education. After all, at the end of the day, formal education will give them credentials that will make them go to a secondary school and on to university. But what happened later on is that formal education was not able to sustain the program, the free primary program as was anticipated. So they started going back to non-formal education, to non-formal schools. And therefore, we're saying that there was a transit between non-formal and formal in terms of enrollment, in terms of participation in education. From 2005, there was also, I moved very fast. From 2005, there was also a reform in education where the government took on board non-formal education, or recognized the introduction of non-formal, the contribution of non-formal education in the socioeconomic and political development of the country. Beforehand, it was seen as not aiding the development of the country. In 2005, there was an official policy that now we acknowledge that non-formal education does contribute to the socioeconomic development of the country. It does contribute by training human resource. It does contribute by income generating activities for the trainees. It does, and therefore dealing with the unemployment and the out of school youth. And it contributed by allowing transition from formal education to informal education, not only in the informal settlements, in the urban informal settlements, but also in the ASAL areas, the arid and semi-arid areas. So we have this kind of intersection coming in because of the intervention of the government through policy. We have this coming in because of the intervention of the government through accommodating non-formal education, which had not been accommodated beforehand. By 1998, there was even a draft policy on non-formal education. And therefore, that was a shift that would bring them closer. There was also an attempt to ensure that all the schools, all non-formal schools were now registered, not just by the other ministries, but also by the Ministry of Education. That, of course, also explains the nexus. While that was happening in the non-formal schools, on the other hand, there was the formalization of the village polytechnics and the National Youth Service. So we wouldn't be talking about those two now as non-formal education. They started as non-formal, but they transited to formal education. Of course, there were reasons for that, including the attitude to non-formal education, including the costs involved, because most non-formal education schools were funded by NGOs and the community. That applies especially to SJSCC, where they had to do it. So they were dependent on funding from these other groups. And in conclusion, therefore, in my conclusion, I'll say that while in the 1970s and in the 1980s, non-formal education was shunned by the Ministry of Education, by the government, later on, there was a realization that non-formal education did indeed provide avenues for access to education for those people who are in arid and semi-arid areas, they're the mobile schools. There are those in the urban informal settlements and those in areas where poverty was very, very keen to make it difficult for them to participate in formal education. There was also a realization that much as we want to provide FPE or free primary education, we do not have the capacity. And therefore, non-formal schools would be our other people to aid us in this. So that is why we have that drop to non-formal schools, transition to formal schools. So the non-formal schools were the ones that took those who left the formal schools. But when they were given the conditions, circumstances, then they also transited to formal schools. And there are examples of the same from these non-formal schools, where there were the continued funding of the learners took place after KCPE. Only issue is that even though there was talk about non-formal secondary schools, these did not pick up as well as the primary schools in Nairobi and Kenya at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Wanyoike, for that presentation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I call throwing somebody under the bus. I think I've been thrown under the bus. The presentation is more of education than history. But having said that, if I got Wanyoike correctly, she began by giving a definition of what is meant by informal, formal, and non-formal education. And she said that informal education was there in pre-colonial Africa, where learning was carried out not in a specific area and time, and learning was also dependent on one's gender, age, and if I may wish to add, one's family occupation. Because if you came from a family of blacksmiths, you are supposed to learn something about blacksmithing. Then she continued to say that the non-formal learning was introduced in Kenya during the colonial period. That non-formal learning took place in the evening hours. And this is also the period where learning was institutionalized. Then she went ahead and discussed learning in post-colonial Kenya. And here she said that the two, that is non-formal education and formal education, were running parallel to each other. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is now a challenge that I am posing to the chairman who is responsible for conducting the seminars, since the seminars are going to continue even in the future, that in next presentations, please invite somebody with adequate knowledge on what is being presented to be a discussant. Now, ladies and gentlemen, now we are coming to the next session where we are going to have comments and questions from listeners, both physical and those who are online. But we first start with those online, with those physical. We'll have 2 rounds of questions. The first round will consist of 3 questions. The second round, again, 3 questions before we move to the viewers online. So ladies and gentlemen, anybody with a comment or question to the presenter, yes, Dr. Gashi, another one. Yes, the gentleman behind. And Dr. Ombonge. But let me also reserve a slot for myself to ask a question. My question to Dr. Wanyoike is that, what parameters did you use to categorize one education system as informal and the other one as formal? And who set these parameters? Or did you use the colonial mentality that anything African was primitive and therefore informal, and anything Western or European was formal? And two, please excuse my ignorance here. I heard you speak that in the colonial period, the non-formal education used to take place in the evening hours. Right now, universities are conducting parallel degree programs, and the students normally come in the evenings. So can we categorize those ones as non-formal? Yes, Dr. Gashi.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mary, for that very interesting presentation. I would like to refer you to the work of the Brazilian educator and philosopher, Paulo Freire, in his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I believe this was a Marxist-influenced analysis of teaching to an oppressed population. I think in his case, he was really mainly talking about the colonized. How do you teach an oppressed population? But I'm more interested in Freire's concept of what he calls the banking method of education, in which the teacher is the sole arbiter of truth, in which case, the student knows nothing, the student is a depository of knowledge, just like the colonizers assumed that the colonized knew nothing, and they had to deculturize them in order to teach them. So my question is this: to what extent do the three modes of education that you have talked about ascribe to the notion that learning is, or maybe is not, a banking method? That the learner is in fact a co-creator, and these are Freire's words, is a co-creator in knowledge. In other words, what lessons lie in your presentation for our education system? How do we impart knowledge? That is my question, so that learning does not become a tool of oppression, so to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Gashi. The gentleman behind.
Thank you very much, George. I'm Ben Yanchoga.
Because you are in spectacles today.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Mary, for that good presentation. It's interesting to some of us who are not educationists, but I just have two concerns. Number one, I would like to know the category of learners. In each case, you are talking of one that takes place in the evening and the other one that takes place in the day. Because my understanding of informal education, it could cut across, from very young people to very old, depending on what they were supposed to learn. And my understanding also of formal education, it also cuts across substantially much on younger children. So I would like to know the category of persons we are talking about in this case. Then secondly, where do we place adult learning? Because I remember in my village, when I was growing up in the 1980s, my mother, who is now very old, joined an adult class called Gumbaru. I don't know if the Gumbaru is a universal term, but that is what we used to call it in our village. She went to school for a few months and then she gave up. She was being taught by another colleague in terms of age, who was a little bit knowledgeable. But what they were taught basically was how to read the Bible and do a few calculations which will help them count their monies. So is that part of formal education or informal education? Because it was not done in the evenings. It was done at around 2 p.m. During the day. So I'm not very sure really whether my mother went through informal education or a formal education. Perhaps you could put it right for me. Thank you very much.
Yes, Dr. Mponge.
Chair.
Carry on.
Yes.
Proceed.
Okay. Aye. Okay. Thank you very much, Mary Wanyoike, for that wonderful presentation. Perhaps as Ndeni says, Mary did not tell us that I've interacted with that work of hers for many years, and we had so many discussions on the same. But however, 3 quick issues. I did not, perhaps this afternoon, maybe I slept kidogo. I did not hear about how Mary has framed her work in terms of theoretical framework or conceptual framework. 2, I did not also hear how she gathered the data for the work. But perhaps the last one is then that how do these 3 categories of education inform the present debates on the shift that we have been having in the country from the colonial period to date in terms of education systems. For example, we know some schools that began as informal schools like Javakali High School. It was mainly for agriculture, but then it changed to become more of informal. So how does Mary's work inform the debate that's going on, particularly the change from 844 to the CBC? Thank you.
That's one is Dr. Mbonge.
Thank you. Thank you, Mwalimu Deni. Mary, this is quite interesting. I'm learning every day, quite an exercise in history of education. And George, we didn't throw you under the bus. Initially, we had Mwalimu Esther Omondi as a moderator and a discussant of this session. And unfortunately, she's kind of not within Nairobi. So she's the one who asked you to come and stand in for her. And I'm sure she knew, and you have demonstrated it, that you have the wherewithal to do that. So thank you, George, for being available and handy to stand in for Mwalimu Esther Omondi. Now, Mary, I am no expert of history of education. So if you find my questions very ignorant, actually that is what they are. One is, I liked what you said about the pre-colonial Kenyan setting. And you provided us a picture of a situation of informal education where you seem to suggest that many things that took place in people's everyday life could be categorized as educational. I hope I got you correctly on that one. Now, my caution here is perhaps we might fall into the trap of the traditional nationalist historians who looked at pre-colonial Africa and gave us a very rosy picture of what was happening and said the problem was colonialism. I think the picture in pre-colonial Africa was much more complex than the one we have received from our nationalist historiography. There are all sorts of contradictions that you see there. So maybe my question will be, do you have what you can regard as clear-cut parameters of what constituted education in pre-colonial Africa and what was not education? Maybe you can help us to understand that and ultimately help you to run away from this rose picture provided by nationalist historians. Of course, your own teacher, Professor Bogongo, creates a picture of very loosey traditional Kisi setting where everything worked and everything was educational from the time a child is born and goes through initiation, and it's like everything was educational. So what constituted education and what did not constitute education in this setting? My second question is, there is something they call apprenticeship. Again, forgive my ignorance about matters education. Where was this in all these three forms that you have very ably given us this afternoon? And I became curious in my time in Italy. They have some forms of training actually that have elements of apprenticeship. For example, if you work in a hotel kitchen for 2 years and you never had any qualification, they allow you to come to Italy and do a course they call food production apprenticeship, where you come and you are trained physically what you can see and relate to in a kitchen setting. For 6 months, and then you go to the industry for another 6 months. Then you come to Italy for 6 months until you finish the 6 months divided until you finish 2 years, and then you can get a certificate in food production. And actually, from my experience, the people in hospitality seem to suggest that those who are trained through food production apprenticeship produce much better chef de parties than the traditional students from high school to college. Maybe you might want to help us understand where does this fall? Now, and more importantly now, as a historian, I don't know, where are the African independent schools which emerged in a fairly polarized setting of the 1940s, I think 30s and 40s and the 50s, when Africans began realizing that mission education was not everything. And then where do you classify these independent schools? And which of these three forms of education that you give us played a role in nurturing nationalist feelings that probably fed into the period of the nationalist confrontation with the British colonial government in Kenya? And I guess probably, Niels, you'll be fascinated by that, by virtue of the work that you are doing on Mau Mau, and then Dr. Gache here. So where are the independent schools? Thank you.
Yes, Mary, you can now respond to those ones before we go to the next round.
Thank you very much for those questions. They are good in the sense that they also make me want to clarify one or two things that I left out in the course of the presentation. The first one was on the parameters to categorize informal, formal, and non-formal education. Now, as I wrote this paper, my focus was mainly on the literature. I was reviewing the literature that talks about informal, non-formal, and formal education. That was my focus, the review of literature. And so my first take was, what do scholars say about these three modes of education? And that is why I started by citing Bokonko and Sifuna, and saying I'm also going to face it so that I start with the pre-colonial period and move to the colonial and then the post-colonial period, and see the kind of literature that is there about these three modes of education. So in the pre-colonial period, I say Sifuna and Bokonko talk about two modes of education. And they say there is informal and non-formal education. Well, when I discussed the formal and non-formal education in the work, I talked about informal education as this other kind of education that does not include apprenticeship. That in the pre-colonial period, there were various ways of transmitting knowledge and skills, so that when you talk about the folktales that were told by our mothers and grandmothers at night or in the evening, when the supper was getting ready, we were supposed to get a moral lesson from that kind of story. When the children interacted during play, they were supposed to learn from one another. When the mothers interacted with the children and told them about the particulars of the families that they should interact with, they were teaching them. In other words, non-informal education, as far as my understanding is concerned, is any form of knowledge that will not have to be supervised and scheduled, and say that these are the schedules that we are going to use, that we can only learn during the day, that we can only learn when there is a teacher. That's my understanding, that learning can take place anytime, anywhere, and the teacher can be anybody, as long as that teacher has knowledge and skills that you don't have. That I can come to your house and find you making chapos. I don't know how to make chapo. I get the experience of making chapo, and therefore I have learned. And that is through the experience of you making chapos. We did not schedule it. That's why I would put it. On the other hand, I would then move to the apprenticeship that we are talking about. And apprenticeship in the pre-colonial period was common in many societies. You want to be a rainmaker, you have to be taught how to make rain. You want to be a blacksmith, you want to be a carpenter, you have to know how to do it. And you associated with the family, yourself with the family that did those things. So you learned that way. But since you are setting a schedule for learning, since you are saying, this is what I want to learn, since you are agreeing on the time frame of the learning, then you are saying there is some element of non-formality in those schedules. So apprenticeship was part of what was considered as non-formal education in pre-colonial period. Therefore, what I'm saying is that while Sifuna and Bogonko talk about just informal and formal, I also think that considering the definitions that come about non-formal, informal, and formal in the post-colonial period, these are Africans who are also observing those definitions, then I would put apprenticeship as part of non-formal education, considering the schedules, considering the flexibility, considering the content is known to both the learner and the teacher, considering the teacher is also known to the learner, and you have organized with the learner how much you're going to take. There is a duration, but that duration will have to be determined by the learner. And if we go to the definition of the same, you will note that in the learning of non-formal education, the learner is at the front of the learning session. She's the one who says, this is what I want to learn. This is my time frame of doing so. Of course, there are instances like the ones I've cited about the NITD, where the administration decides we cannot teach these courses during the day because you are busy in practical work during the day. So can we find some other time when we can teach these same courses? Now, those who taught those courses that were supposed to be taught during the day and were now taught in the evening were paid for that service. You would maybe think about it in terms of extra, what is it called? This overtime. Yeah, they were being paid overtime because they were employed formally to work during the day. Now they are coming to work from 5:30 to 7:30. They can place their classes just like we do at 2, even though it is supposed to be at that particular time. And therefore, they are not, they are organized in a way. There is a deliberate effort to organize what is going to be done by who, where, and when. That's the distinction that I'm trying to make with the informal education. When it comes to formal education, the schedules are clear. The teachers are clear. The duration is clear. Okay. So that would be my characterization.
About the example I gave of attempts to integrate the formal and the apprenticeship, just like the example of the Kenya food production apprenticeship course that what is happening here?
What is happening here in attempts to
integrate the formal
and apprenticeship? Okay. Most of the courses that McKay introduced in the 844 system were courses that were done outside the formal education system. There was little of what he was doing in the manner that he suggested that was done in the formal education system. So he picked a bit of it and brought it to the formal education system. And incidentally, when they realized they did not have teachers to teach the technical courses, they were saying, bring the carpenters to school, let them teach the students these very courses that is there. By it being taught in a formal setting, it also became a formal setting. And those are the complexities that I was talking about. And that is why I also cited Aaron Rogers and Ekudayo Thompson, who said, you cannot see informal education as independent to non-formal or to formal education. There is intersectionality of the two. The other one is Aaron Rogers, and maybe that one is what we would look at as colonial mentality, when he says that there is progression from non-formal, from informal to non-formal. He sees it as a continuum. Okay. So that distinction in practice is certainly there. In terms of competence-based curriculum, those technical skills that were in 844 are more or less the same skills that we find in the curriculum. And we are kind of saying, we did not achieve this through 844. Can we try to mold whatever we have in a way that we can do it better, that we can involve the parents so that there is participation, participatory education. There is participation of also the parents and better participation of the learners so that what they get will be helpful for them in future. In 844, I cited an example where one of the writers was saying that the students were told to make desks. And instead of the students making desks, they would go to a carpenter. The carpenter would make a desk. The student would present the desk for examination, and that would be all. Has the student learned the skill? No. It is there. The expectation is that the student will learn the skill, but the student has not learned the skill. The student has gone to the one who makes the desk and has presented the same desk for examination. He passes, of course, but he doesn't have the skill. And that is why I was explaining that non-formal education is functional. You have to show that you have understood and learned the skill that you went to learn. If you are learning about carpentry, do the desk under my supervision, so that I know that you have actually learned that skill. Let me see the others. Then we have Dr. Gashehi and the pedagogy of the oppressed, the banking concept. Yeah. Oh, that was common in colonial Africa, the banking concept. It was coming from the point of view that the Europeans knew, the Africans did not know, that the Africans did not have a mode of education that would sustain them and lead them to development. But of course, the readings on pre-colonial education explain very clearly that African education was contextual, and it served the purpose at the time that it was taught. It was not abstract, okay? It was not abstract as formal education came to be abstract during the colonial period. They would do reading and writing, all right. But when it came to the subjects had no bearing in what they wanted to know. And that lack of bearing in what they want to do is partly what led to the establishment of the independent schools. Those who wanted the independent schools to be established were saying, we want some relevant education. Teach us our history, not European history. Teach us our rhymes, because we also have rhymes. They were lullabies. Why not ask us to come with our lullabies? Why tell us to sing Mary had what? What was it? Mary had I'm not forgetting that lullaby that was very common during the colonial period. And the Snow White, the mention of Snow White and all those others, the rhymes that were European rhymes, talking about wool and the Africans not having a sheep to shear. So they were saying, this is not relevant to us. Tell us. Let us know our own history. Let us do it in the way that we know how. Don't bank the education to us. We had ways of doing it. We did it by observing. We did it by reason. We did it by imitation. We did it by mimicry. We know how to do it. Okay. So that was evident in the early years of formal education. And therefore, of course, when Freire was talking about the banking concept, he also said that education should liberate people. It has a liberative force. So you're not just learning to know. You should be liberated from poverty. You should be liberated from lack of knowledge. You should be liberated from any other deficiency that you have. And that takes me to Planck, who wrote The Means of Our Salvation in Brazil. And he said, education is a means of our salvation from poverty, from ignorance, any other deficiencies. And when he talked about it, that time, Brazil was also going through the challenges of out-of-school youth, which were common in the third world or in the developing countries. So in Brazil, instead of talking about non-formal schools, they were talking about parallel programs, parallel to formal education. You will teach formal education, bits of formal education, but this is parallel because it's flexible. It has diverse courses to offer to the people. It has diverse people to learn. It has diverse venues. So all those features then move it away from formal education. And we see a distinct education system. So when we come to Kenya, in fact, during the Mau Mau period, let me use that example, the Christian missions had various programs that ensured that the children, the youth, the adults were busy. This is where I argue that education was also a form of control, because when you are busy learning, then you cannot be involved with the Mau Mau. When you are busy doing these things, then you cannot participate in other things that were there. So the argument is there that education was also a form of control. So how did they do it? The children were taught literacy. The youth had skills to learn. The adults, there were adult education classes, music, drama, all those programs were there facilitated by the Ministry of Community Development. And then here is therefore the other distinction that I use. When you talk about formal education, you're talking about an education that is supposed to be provided by the Ministry of Education. That is where it's supposed to be, not in any other ministry, not in any other department. But this is an education that is either not registered, and when it is registered under gender, under cooperative societies, under the community development. Okay, so it misses out on that aspect of formality in terms of provision of the personnel, in terms of supervision, in terms of curriculum. You don't know what they are doing outside there when they are doing it. And that is why there was a challenge in the 1970s and 1980s when there were those people who took advantage of this non-formal education and would tell students, here we are offering education, would not register them for examinations, and then that brought in a lot of problems. So the quagmire in the 1970s and the 1980s in the field of non-formal education was also brought on by people who took advantage of the out-of-school youth and children and said, we are now offering non-formal education. But it was not much different from formal education. By the 1970s, Udugu decided to have non-formal schools. SJCC decided to have non-formal schools. Same curriculum, same schedules. There was no difference. In fact, one of the others, Gathenya, cite a situation when she presented a paper on non-formal education, said there was a time that the minister, that was Professor Ngeri, wanted to go to these schools that are in the informal settlements. Yeah, and when he was taken, he said, what is the difference between this school and the one that you're calling non-informal school? They are in uniform, they are running the curriculum, the teachers are there. I can see some of them qualify quite well. So what's the difference? See? So the other one, I think I've talked about the category of the learners and the children and the youth. The adult education classes are often categorized in non-formal rather than formal education. Yes, they learn literacy. Yes, they learn arithmetic, reading and writing. They do all those things, but they are not within the formal education hierarchical structure, where we said formal education would be defined as any form of education that has a rigid hierarchical structure and that has certification and that has a uniform curriculum for all, uniform time schedule. So when you talk about, you expect it to be, okay, clear. Non-formal education, on the other hand, is not very clear because it has many parameters to meet. It has many people involved. The adult education classes that were common, especially even before the colonial period, were classes that in this case targeted one group of people, the adults. And the intention was to reduce the illiteracy rates in the country. And therefore, whenever they met and were taught arithmetic, reading and writing, so that they stop using the thumb when they go to the bank or any other areas. So we also note that in adult literacy classes in time, they also included skills training. They realized that if we call the adults to just come, read and write in the afternoon, a whole afternoon, and there are people who have other businesses, we are going to include skills training. And therefore, you'll find that most adult education courses, especially in independent Kenya, also came with skills training of various types, beehive keeping, about housekeeping, all those courses came with the adult literacy classes. So as long as they are not of age as per the formal education entry requirements, as long as their training will not lead to certification and exams that are standardized. The exam is standardized, the curriculum is standardized, everything is uniform, then they would fall more on the side of non-formal than on the side of formal. But like I say, and I note elsewhere, there is no fine boundary between the three modes of education. The emphasis then is which of these characteristics, these features that we are talking about, put it in informal, non-formal, or formal. And then at the back of your mind, you know it is possible for the interaction to be taking place behind the scenes, that you can move from informal to non-formal and to formal, and vice versa. So the emphasis is on the features. The emphasis is on the diversity and flexibility of the programs in each of the areas. You talk about theoretical framework. Whether you're talking about informal, non-formal, or formal, at the end of the day, you'll be saying, I am training these people. I am in a human capital formation enterprise. So that remains the theoretical framework that I used even for this, because whether you are talking about informal education, I was talking about the nexus, whether you're talking about informal education or non-formal education, you will still talk about human capital development. The only difference is that the schedules and the timings and the focus from learner-centered to teacher-centered we see in the non-formal and formal education. That is why we talk about skills upgrading. That's the purpose. You want to have a category of workers in this by training them. So you train them formally or non-formally because their schedules allow them to be formal or non-formal. How do the three modes of education change from 844 to CBC? I think I answered that in a way when I was talking about 844 in light of the others. Clear-cut parameters. The clear-cut parameters are not there. They were not there with Bokonko. They were not there with Sifuna. They were not there with Kenneth King. Kenneth King actually that element of the complexities of defining in literature is illustrated by Kenneth King, because he says, I think this mode of education is what is sponsored. Then when he starts talking about other modes of education, he says, this is informal sector where the numbers are not known. So he was thinking about the informal sector instead of the informal education. And the reason I believe for that was that he focused not on institutions, but on education and training that was done in the garages, in the workshops. Unlike the other kind of non-formal education that was done in institutions like the non-formal schools and SJC. These were institutions that eventually took up from or graduated, if I would use that word, from non-formal to formal education. And they started even doing examinations because the pressure was high from the parents too, that our children need to be graded, our children need to move to the next level. And so they stopped doing non-formal education curriculum alone. They moved to formal education curriculum. The government also changed. KNEC, the Kenya National Examination Council, allowed them to do the exams in private centers. Okay. So I think I have answered, Law.
Now, for the purpose of time, because I'm told this is a departmental meeting after this, we would have another round of questions from those present physically, but we will take comments and questions from those viewers online. Anybody online with a comment, a question, or any concern? Anybody with any concern? Those who are online? Is there anything on the chat? Viewers online, any question? All right. Let me now hand over this to the chairman to tell us what to do in the next session. Yes, of course.
Mary, thanks for that very good presentation. I have two observations. One is a question. The other one is a suggestion. Let me begin with the suggestion. There is a rite of passage among the Kikuyu, which the church now has made part and parcel of its activities. So I don't know where you would fit that kind of change from a rite of passage that's very informal to somewhat a formalized process now in the church. Now, following on that, then my concern is, to what extent did the formalization of the informal education system, to what extent did the formalization of informal learning or education bring any influence or changes for that matter? Thank you.
Yes, Mary, ask that very fast, and then.
Can I take advantage of that then? Two questions. Thank you very much, Mary. That was very nice to listen to. I have two very simple questions. One is about those who did exams as private candidates. I think this happened for a long time. Where do we place them? I kind of heard you talk about it when you were answering one of the questions, but it was not very clear to me, and forgive me for that. The other one is about the CMS. They seem to have had a very strong role in the development of non-formal schools. What made them focus on this so completely? And the last one is that the non-formal schools had a purpose different from the formal. And when we come to 2003, we have the free education. I'm just wondering, did this have a negative impact on the non-formal schools, and what was the impact? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This is just a small one.
Mary, I like the idea where you said that in the colonial era, you know, education was essentially a tool for colonialism. I was wondering whether this was continued to Kenya's post-colony. And I'm having in mind, and of course with the deepest respect to people who went to Starehe Center, the initial project was one that was supposed to reform the youth, particularly those who had some links to Mau Mau, and reform them into subservient, disciplined, and ordered to fit within a certain context of what was understood to be development. And therefore, when you look at casually, of course, there needs to be research on this. Such schooling system hardly produces people who question and interrogate the status quo. Very excellent workers, efficient and effective, but then they are outstanding for obedience to authority and respect and all that. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, Mary, comment, answer those questions within the next 3 minutes. Then we invite the chair to tell us what to do next.
Thank you. I'll start with Dr. Gona's comment on the rite of passage, that it is being formalized. When I look at the rite of passage in the pre-colonial period and into today's world, I see two different things. In the pre-colonial period, the rite of passage was a way of legitimizing a person's identity in the community. It was a way of telling the initiate that you've now become an adult and there are responsibilities of adulthood. And there was a lot of learning for those who underwent the rite. That is why both Sifuna and Bogonko placed it in formal education. I place it in non-formal education because among the Kikuyu, for instance, there was no circumcision every year. There were age groups, and age groups happened after maybe 3-4 years. Then you would say, now we have enough candidates for this. There is also the fact that the training does not take long. It's about 2-3 weeks, and you're done with the sessions. Then the person can go and do other one. The other kind of training that the person will come across is when he joins the senior warriors or becomes an elder. Then there'll be training for that, depending on how much, on the level and the grading of that particular person. So there were individuals who were trained in the customs and traditions of the people. There were those who did not go through that training. They learned it from the others who were trained. Okay, so that's why I praise it in non-formal education. Now, to what extent did formalization of informal and formal education? Oh, looks like I didn't get this very clearly. Do you mind, Dr. Gona?
What were the impacts
of formalization? Thank you. Thank you very much. Formalization came in a number of ways. The village polytechnics were formalized. The village polytechnics were for those school leavers, primary school leavers who were not able to transit to secondary education. So they were told, go here, learn some skill. Now, when they were formalized, then it meant that some of the reasons why they were established were also done away with. For instance, some were established because these people could not even afford secondary school education, had they the admission. 2, the numbers were high for the out of school leavers. 3, these village polytechnics were supposed to be to be context in the community. So if the community has beehives, then you learn about beekeeping. If it is an agricultural community, then you learn about agriculture. So when they were formalized, then it means it is the KICD or the Ministry of Education that would make a curriculum for the VPs, which means that there was a loss of, there was no connection between what was learned formally and what was learned non-formally, because whether you come from a beekeeping area, you will have to learn something. Whether you come from the beekeeping area or not, then beekeeping is what you learn. It is not of immediate utilization in the economy because it does not speak to the needs of that particular economy. So that's 1. 2, when they were formalized, then it meant that this training that was being done in a non-formal setting has been taken to a formal setting. So what would be the difference between this training in a formal setting and training in the technical schools, for instance? Because our technical schools set aside for training these very skills that the school leavers would have trained in the village polytechnics. Remember, they were supposed to transit to secondary schools, but they did not transit. So eventually, the technical schools were also done away with. And eventually, then what was established were the what? These ones that were, why am I forgetting their name? They catered for the Form 4 leavers, not the primary school leavers. So since they catered for the primary school leavers, then there was a gap. Where do these primary school leavers who cannot go to academic schools, to secondary schools to learn other academic subjects, where have we placed them? Are we dealing with the out of school, with the out of school challenge? Are we dealing with the challenge of unemployment? Are we dealing with the challenge of non-entry into secondary schools and therefore continuing with the formation of capital or the training of the human resource at a level that for a long time was neglected? Because those who went to academic schools, the aim was go to secondary school, go to higher education for those who found higher education, go to university. There's nothing in between. If you don't go to university, you fall off the way. And therefore, these are the institutions that were training the TVETs and the others that were training did not cater for the primary schools. So the problem of out of school youth at primary school level continued. And that is why by the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, the non-formal schools now started coming up to take care of these school leavers that were there. So then private exams, yes, there were private exams. And these were done in private centers. Initially, they were not even allowed to do the exams. But with time, with the realization that this is a sector that will not just go away, then there was a provision. You can teach your learners, like SJC taught their students, and they would go to another non-formal school that was mandated to allow them to sit the exam there. If not that non-formal school, just a center, just like any other private cadete, and they would be allowed to sit the exam there. So eventually, having sat the exam, the next handle was, to which school are they going to? And that became a challenge again, because public schools were not ready to admit them. But eventually that too was a handle that was passed, so that now SJCC could say, we have students in Aquinas, we have students in Isri, which are public schools. So the transition was there, in spite of the fact that they did the exams in the public schools. FPE and the impact on non-formal education. When FPE was introduced in 2003, there was a shift, a movement from non-formal education. And when the students moved from non-formal education, they went to the public schools where there was free primary education, only to, after some time, realize that the teachers are not enough. We are squeezed because the classrooms are not adequate. We cannot say that it's fully free because there are some levies that we also have to pay. So what was provided as FPE turned out to be something that some people were also not able to afford. So what happened? They started moving back to non-formal schools. They started moving back to low-cost private schools in the informal settlements, where you can pay 10 bob for your child's lunch when you have the 10 bob, instead of being told for this one semester we need 2,000. We don't have the 2,000, but every day I can give you 10 bob so that my child eats in your school. So those were some of the things that happened after the FPE was introduced. The non-formal institutions also expanded their programs. Now they realized, oh, we are getting back our students. Let us now include even the skills that we are not involved in. So there was expansion of that, and that was noted in Udugu, that was noted in Gitegeme, and other institutions that were non-formal at the time. Okay. I think I've done it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, friends, I think you realize how deep this subject can be. And at some point, there's a question I raised about education and the need to create subservient subjects of the state or the queen or whatever it is. But that is something we can revisit informally. Now that we also have informal education, we can revisit that informally. And then there is a lot. I was also thinking about what used to be called community schools, Harambee schools, where I went to from Form 1 to Form 4. It was a local Harambee school. which only needed a roof, no walls around it. And we had our education from Form 1 to Form 4. Where were those categorized, and what was that? Anyway, I stand to do two things. One is, I'm hearing my echo. One is to very sincerely thank our presenter this Nairobi afternoon. Thank you, Mary. I feel like I'm more informed now than ever before from the kind of conversation that we have had. For the rest of our visitors, those online and those on site, we really appreciate you because you have become part and parcel of this communication. For colleagues from the department and other departments within the University of Nairobi who are following us online, and those who turned up here, we really appreciate you. Let's continue with this conversation. This is what defines the fact that we are in the academy. Our next presentation will be on the 6th of April, 2 weeks today, 2023. And we are going to have one of our PhD students, Isaiah Ngoho, talking about culture, banditry, and pastoral conflicts in the Kerio Valley. And that speaks probably much more directly with some of the issues that the government is trying to deal with in Kenya's wild north. And I'm sure Mr. Ngoho is going to delve into some of the fundamentals that will inform the protracted nature of the violence and the chaos that we have had in northern Kenya. And I'm sure this is something that is of interest, not just to us as academics, but also to policymakers out there who are struggling to deal with a monster that don't seem to be ending. We welcome you all on the 6th of April, same place, same time. See you. Number two, I just want to say thank you those who joined us. We can now release you and we release those who are online because as members of staff, we have a staff meeting actually beginning now. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.